To launch your startup career, collaboration between Startup Exchange and AKPsi at Georgia Tech. My name is Peter. I'm one of the co-directors of Startup Exchange. To give you a little bit of background, we are the largest student entrepreneurship organization in the Southeast. We do a lot of talks with founders and entrepreneurs from the area and also from around the US. We do networking events, workshops, and pretty much everything in between. Today, we're starting off with a keynote from Indra, who is actually an ex-Startup Exchange director and also an alum of AKPsi and the co-founder of SORA Schools. Then we're going to move into a networking workshop, do a quick talk from Nakia at ATDC, and then move on to Gatherly for networking with some startup recruiters and founders. So I'm going to kick it over to Indra to give an intro and get started.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. But first of all, I did want to say that I'm generally pretty excited that there are a lot of you here that are actually interested in early stage startups. So I went to Georgia Tech from 2014 to 2018. And in that time, I'll say that generally towards the beginning, it definitely wasn't as exciting in terms of startup culture at Georgia Tech. There are definitely more people, way more people interested in going to work at, I don't know, Home Depot or Google or Procter and Gamble or something like that before when I started at Georgia Tech. So it's actually pretty cool to see that a lot of you are actually interested in joining and potentially working at early stage startups, which I think are a really cool opportunity, both in terms of your career as well as just general interest. So just to give a little background on myself, even though I already gave you a slight sneak peek. So I'm the co-founder of SORA Schools. It's basically a new kind of high school. In its current form, it's a live, virtual, project-based high school where students explore their interest in future careers. Basically, the company is on a mission to build the best high school in the world. So we started it back in, we started working on it back in, I would say early 2018, right around the time I graduated. And we officially launched the school in the fall of 2019. And currently we have 40 students. We started off with just 7, so it's definitely grown a lot since then. It's constantly growing now. And currently we have about 12 employees, 11 to 12, give or take, a contractor or two. And we've also raised about $2.85 million from some pretty top tier investors across the country. So today I'm going to talk to you all about early stage startup recruiting, just how to think about applying to these job opportunities, how to make yourself stand out, where to even find these opportunities, but also, of course, what actually makes a good sort of employee at an early stage startup. I'm speaking from the perspective, of course, as someone who has hired people for my startup, but also from the perspective of, frankly, you all, when I was a student around your age, which makes you sound incredibly old for some reason. I'm like 24, but I'm not that old. But regardless, I'm speaking from the perspective of both someone who's both in your shoes just a few years ago, looking to work at an early stage startup, and someone who's actually hired employees for my own company. So before I sort of kick things off, I'm going to try something slightly experimental where I will ask you all for a slight amount of interaction. So so because I'm aware that in virtual events is generally not good to ask a bunch of people to speak, if you all could just put in the chat when I ask this question. So just curious, when you think of an early stage startup, what sort of if you had to describe an early stage startup, or what it could be an example of a company, it could be a little 1-sentence description of what you think an early stage startup is, feel free to just go ahead and put that in the chat. So just to repeat, basically the question is, what do you think an early stage startup is? And again, you can put examples of companies you think are early stage startups. You can put a little 1-sentence description or a couple of words, whatever you think makes the most sense when you say, early stage startup, that's X. And I'll probably read off a couple answers and stuff. I'll give it a little time to percolate. Okay, that's enough percolating. Let's see. So actually, wait, Peter, real quick, can people see the Zoom group chat when I put it up, or does it just hide all the Zoom stuff when I'm sharing my screen?
I think it'll hide it.
Oh, it hides it? Okay, cool. Just making sure. Okay, so in that case, I can just read some answers. So pre-product market fit. Everything is on fire, but that's okay. Bootstrapping company creating the MVP and attracting investors. A company that doesn't know what it is yet. Volatile, but that keeps it going. A small group of people who saw a problem and are trying to actually fix it. A company with a prototype that has potential, an idea, pre-product launch, ideation, someone with an idea that may or may not have been realized into a company or may not have any sales to date, still discovering what to do, focusing on product development and building a customer base, have idea product discovery. So actually, those are a lot of pretty good answers. You're generally all pretty right. That generally describes what a startup is. It's a company that's basically still figuring out its business model, still figuring out a way to scale, figuring out an audience. And of course, there's like a wide spectrum of sort of companies that like stages of where the company falls. Some companies that are super early stage are just figuring out everything. And then some companies that, of course, that are later stage are basically just trying to figure out how to optimally get to the things that they identified in the first stage. So, and most of you have somewhat notion of like what kind of companies are like startups in your mind. Now, the thing is that like the media likes to portray startups as like these really cool companies that are just rocket ships, right? Rocket ships for growth. They're growing by 10, 20, 50 employees a month, and they're growing like crazy. They attracted really cool investors and they're all over the news. But of course, as many of you have probably heard, because you all are not, completely unaware, is that startups also have a lot of downsides. Like startups, for one, like when you're an employee at an early stage startup, not even, being the founder or an entrepreneur yourself, but when you're working at an early stage startup, there's a lot of, there's a lot of disadvantages, right? Like compared to like a big company. Like a job at an early stage startup means that you can be doing basically the job of 5 people, like at a big company, whereas, when you join Google and you're spending your entire project designing like the color of a button, at a startup, you may be doing like 5 things that are basically just different jobs. Because that's, at a startup, early stage startup, you're wearing a lot of hats, even when you're not the founder to some extent. And because of that, like segueing into that, like there's a lot at a startup that's not defined, right? You may ask your boss or the founder, like, hey, so like, how are we getting customers? Or like, is there any documentation for this process? And they might go, good question. We're still figuring that out. And there's a lot on that theme of like a lot of startups that haven't sort of figured out everything. One of them is just the fact that startups face a lot of existential risks. And this is important for you to consider, even as like you're considering career opportunities, whether they're internships or even like full-time positions at startups, is that frankly speaking, the earlier the startup, of course, on average, the generally the riskier it is. And there's a lot of existential risks that face a startup, which directly, of course, impact you and your job, because obviously if the startup fails, then you don't have a job to some extent. And that's I'm being very frank, like that's a real risk. Even I know this as like a founder of a startup, like in the sense that I'm now responsible for the livelihoods of all my employees. And so, and this is slightly, actually, this is pretty negative, but I'm being frank in the sense that there may be existential risks that plague the business. And also, as the last thing, is that for some of you that are more exposed to like big company opportunities, like if you're interested in working at like a Google or something like that, like some of you are familiar with the kinds of programs they have there. Like they have a 2-year rotational program, or they have an associate product manager position that's like prestigious or whatever, or they have like a mentorship track, or they have company sponsorship programs where you have like a sponsor. You might have defined promotion tracks and like yearly reviews and stuff like that. Obviously at a startup, they don't really have any of that. There's no real formal training in many cases, because everything is basically learned as you go. There might be like an initial day where they set you up with the computer and like walk you through like the stuff and the documents, but for the most part, and especially with the early stage startups, a lot of it is just figuring it out as you go along. And that's describing all these potential negatives. Frankly speaking, it can be kind of daunting. But just curious, like after I've sort of went over all these things about sort of like the negatives basically of life at an early stage startup, how many of you all are actually still interested in working at an early stage startup? You can do it by like a show of like hand emojis or whatever. I'm actually kind of curious because I don't know if I can see that. Oh, I guess if I like do the little thing. Oh, I can see it. Cool. Okay, yeah, so still a decent amount of you, which is probably good. That's good. So with that case, we can kind of get started we're talking about early stage startup recruiting. So what makes a good startup employee? And of course, why it matters to you, because this is mostly speaking from my perspective, because I've hired people that have worked at my startup. So when the, come on screen, you can do it. Yeah, so early stage startups. So the difference between a big company, early stage startups, in the sense of like looking for people to recruit, is that startups by nature are looking for specialists with room to grow. Basically, employees who can kind of wear a lot of hats. Whereas a big company is basically looking for someone who can do a very specific thing and do that thing only basically. You know, they might be like, we need someone to, you know, do marketing ops and to very specifically optimize the email marketing funnel so we can like increase it by like 10%, hopefully, by hiring this person that can like do this job or something like that. Whereas an early stage startup goes, we need someone who can basically run our digital marketing, but also kind of like do some like, you know, social media marketing, and also kind of like do some email marketing, and also kind of do some like paid ads and stuff. Like to some extent, an early stage startup has a defined role in that that's what they're going to hire the person for, you know, whether they're hiring a front end engineer or they're hiring, you know, a salesperson or whatever. Like they obviously, they need to be able to do the job, but they need to look sort of what I'm going to call like T-shaped, where they need someone who can like do a bit of everything else and sort of in some extent grow with the company, because as the company grows, you know, obviously the startup would like to sort of keep talent within, much like any other company. And so ideally they're hoping that the employee can also grow with the company, maybe take on other roles, maybe like potentially grow into a managerial position or a leadership position. And so they look for people with potential to grow. And sort of going back to the point about being able to do the job, let's be clear, like that's sort of very fundamental when it comes to a startup, in the sense that they have to hire someone that can actually do the job. You know, they can't be at the stage where startups are not at a stage, whether they're 10 people, they're 20 people, they're 50 people, they're not really at a stage where they can go, oh, we can just hire someone and they'll hopefully kind of figure it out maybe, like, or, you know, we'll grow and train them. Remember what I talked about where they don't have a lot of formal training? That kind of goes the same with like hiring employees, in the sense that we, and me speaking as a startup founder, we cannot afford to hire someone that is basically just going to hopefully get trained and figure it out in like 3 months or something like that. Like we need them to basically be able to do the job, like almost ideally as soon as possible. And so, you know, we don't, because we don't have a lot of time to grow and train people. So that's generally what you need to keep in mind, is that when you're looking at career opportunities at startups, like you need to be able to actually do the job, or at the very least, learn how to do it very quickly. And of course, you need to be also be open to potentially doing other things as well. So talking about like the actual roles at a startup. So some of you, again, may be exposed to big companies where you're the difference between the types of roles that are available at big companies are that there may be a lot of optimizer or analyzer or strategizer type positions, type roles at these big companies. You know, maybe you're a consultant, maybe you're just, you know, a business analyst or something and figuring out like a process. Like at a startup, there's not really any of that. There's no third category. There's basically just building the product or selling the product. And pretty much every role kind of like fits in between the two. You might be an engineer and building the thing, or a designer helping build the thing. You might be a salesperson selling the thing, or a marketer basically driving leads for the salesperson to sell to. Like for the most part, you just fall in one of these categories. And if you can't do one of them, or in some cases, if you do both, that's great. But if you can't do one of them, then you don't really have a role at a startup. So when you apply to startup job opportunities and stuff, like you're like, oh, like I want to go work at SORA or whatever, and I have a job opening for front engineer, like, you know, then basically position yourself as I can actually help them design this product. Or when you're looking at job opportunities, like you need to think about like, okay, obviously bottom line, they care about whether or not I can do one of these two. And so that's generally what you're going to frame your application as. And I'll talk more about reaching out to startups, of course, and like how to like make yourself stand out. So on that note, that's this section of the presentation, which is actually how to recruit for these startups. So when looking at sort of applying to startup job opportunities, like it's again very different from big companies, right? Startups don't really have a lot of hiring resources. You know, they don't really know, you know, they don't have a lot of brand equity, and so it's actually pretty hard to find. You all probably may have experienced this because you're interested in early stage startups. It's actually kind of hard to find like cool opportunities at early stage starts, specifically because they kind of have trouble like themselves, like figuring out how to like put themselves out there and to get in front of people, whether it's because of limited resources or limited know-how. So this section of the presentation will basically talk about how to actually find these opportunities, how to make yourself stand out, and of course, things you should generally expect. So here's a pretty text-heavy slide, mostly by design, because I want you all to actually kind of like pay attention to the specific steps. So when we initially raised our seed round of 2.5 million or whatever it was, we started looking to hire people pretty much immediately, which is pretty much across the board, I'll say, for most early stage startups that raise money, is that once they hire the money, they're gonna have to put the money to work really quickly, because otherwise it's just sitting there and accruing opportunity cost. So at SORA, when we said, oh, we're going to raise this money because we need to hire these generally these people, we already had defined roles of what we're looking for. For example, these are not all the roles, but here's a couple examples. I wanted a growth marketer who had worked 2 to 4 years at an early stage startup, which is like super specific, or like a curriculum designer with 3 to 5 years of education design experience, ideally at some type of school. And for these opportunities, just like any company, we initially, Java, gosh, don't download Java. So initially we tapped our networks, much like any company. We asked friends, we posted on Twitter, like, hey, does anyone know anyone that'd be good for this position? And then we went out to the job boards, went externally. So we went on AngelList, we went on LinkedIn, we went on EdSurge, Hippopotamus, and I'll talk about some of those like channels later. And so after that, we filtered through the candidates, mainly paying attention to the ones that stood out. And then after that point, our hiring process is pretty straightforward. We had initial screening over the phone, and then we had a final interview over Zoom. And that was pretty much our whole hiring process for the most part, for a lot of these hires that we made. Now, where actually find these job opportunities? So I talked about the job boards initially, that I mentioned before, like AngelList, LinkedIn, and all that. And so I'll kind of describe each of them because I think they're good examples and archetypes. LinkedIn is easy because I'm pretty sure most of you are aware of LinkedIn. If you're not, it's a job social media website, a professional social media website, and a lot of companies host their jobs there for their open positions. And so LinkedIn is like a good catch-all. Like a lot of companies, probably not the early stage startups, but like generally once they kind of grow up a little, they'll start to post their opportunities there and their positions. That's where we posted our positions. But we also use AngelList. So AngelList is basically just LinkedIn for startups, is the best way to describe it. So a lot of startups, particularly even earlier stage ones, will post their job opportunities there because they know that basically the platform also attracts people who are interested in working at early stage startups. So AngelList is a very good way to sort of find a lot of opportunities that you otherwise might not be able to find on your own or on LinkedIn. And another place to start thinking about are sort of industry verticalized like channels, like an EdSurge. So EdSurge is basically EdTech like job board. Just EdTech companies like SORA is not really EdTech, but kind of education. Like the companies like ours, companies like OutSchool or iExcel or Fiveable. I don't know. I'm just inserting a lot of EdTech companies, and so you'll find that there's actually a fair amount of like these verticalized job boards. Like there might be an EdSurge basically for health tech, or for fintech, or for marketing tech. There's different industry verticals, and these are good ways to kind of like get in front of find these potential jobs that may not be available elsewhere. And of course, they just kind of put them all on like a nice little list, which is kind of nice. So those are the industry verticalized job boards. Then there's the location specific job boards. So Hippopotamus, for example, is basically a startup news outlet for the whole of the Southeast, and they also have a job board that they use, that a lot of our companies like mine use to basically just post jobs there to get more local candidates. So those are the types of like job boards that you can kind of consider when looking at finding these opportunities at startups. Another thing is just the internet. So there's like two sides of this. One is very obvious and one is a little more non-obvious. So the internet, obviously, you can look up stuff. When I was basically your age and looking up different companies to join, I would literally Google startup internship San Francisco, and then hope a bunch of links would pop up, and then I would just click on all of them, have like a huge list of tabs, and basically just go through all of them to see if I could find anything that was actually applicable to me. And I would pretty much repeat that for like days and weeks on end. And obviously, it's a very brute force way of doing it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I mean, as most people will tell you, like if you're looking for jobs, you're looking for jobs, and you're going to do whatever it takes. So, the internet is a powerful tool. You can find a lot of random opportunities at random corners of the internet, I'll say. But the more non-obvious method of using the internet, so, and I should have included a pretty little image like for the internet as well on here, is that is actually a website called Twitter. So most of you are pretty familiar with Twitter, thanks to the president. But Twitter, aside from being a place to basically just post memes and random like fun, non-serious, or sorry, yeah, non-serious, silly things, Twitter, which I still use Twitter for. Twitter, frankly speaking, is also very, very potentially useful for people interested in tech startups. So there's a whole, there's a whole like online community, and not in a defined way. It's more like social circles, basically, of people who use Twitter that are, founders in tech, or people who worked at early stage startups, or people who just love interacting with people in the community. They're founders, investors, and like VCs and stuff that all use Twitter for more professional purposes. And in some cases, there are a lot of these opportunities that you'll find on Twitter that are not available at like just these random job boards that I previously mentioned. You might be following someone who's like, oh yeah, by the way, like we're hiring our first engineer to work at our startup because we recently raised like $2.5 million from Sequoia Capital. Anyone interested in the job op? Here's the description, basically. And so there's going to be a lot of these like opportunities that pop up just by following basically the right people that you don't that you're not going to find elsewhere. And frankly speaking, like Twitter is a fantastic way to build your network, because for me, for example, like we've met some of our current investors just because of our Twitter. Like that's how powerful a platform it is. Obviously, Twitter is not easy to kind of like get into. It's much like anything. You have to put effort, you have to put time into it, you have to follow the right people, you have to like slowly build up your own presence. But it's actually a pretty valuable opportunity, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you about that in case you weren't aware, because I was not aware of this when I got on Twitter like in 2016. I became more aware of it when I was starting a company in 2018. And lastly, is an easy one, is friends. So, like I said, most companies, when they start hiring, they initially look to hire within internally, but obviously at a startup, there's not many people to hire internally because there's like 10 people or 20 people. So pretty much right after hiring internally is hiring basically off referrals or friend networks or professional associates or whatever. And that's pretty much what friends do. You just have to be friends with people in the community. You could be part of the membership in Startup Exchange. You could be going to Startup Exchange events. You could be, I don't know, insert another Startup Exchange thing because I love plugging the organization. Or you could just be friends with founders in CreateX. Like there's a lot of these opportunities that just come from friend to friend. And if you're interested in potentially working in a early stage startup, the best way is just to be friends with people in early stage startups, whether they're the founders or employees or investors or what have you. That's kind of job and hiring 101 to some extent, but in the startup mindset. So the last part of my presentation is just how to make yourself stand out. So because this is important as well. Obviously it's important in a big company and in any sort of hiring, but with startups, it's especially important because of, remember I said, like limited opportunities and also like not many resources to promote themselves. So here's like an example. So when I posted one position for my startup, I got like 300 applications or something dumb like that. Frankly speaking, I'm aware that some big companies get way more applications, but I think it's pretty exciting because my startup didn't exist 2 years ago. So, but either way, it was a lot of applications. There's a lot of reading, and frankly, I don't have a lot of time. So I basically considered like 26 of them. And frankly speaking, I built a pretty solid like hiring process and like a pretty good candidate pool off just the 26. I still kind of thumbed through the 300, but like the 26 made all the more difference. The difference was that they actually emailed me and basically pitched themselves to some extent. Some of them pitched themselves better than others, but they stood out. And so I reached out to them because they had higher intent than the other ones. And at a startup, I'm basically just trying to make the best decision in the smallest amount of time possible to be the most efficient. So yeah, like I said, the people that emailed me got noticed. And finding email of like founders is like pretty easy for an early stage startup. Like it's basically just first name at companywebsite.com or like first name dot last name at companywebsite.com. It's like, these are really simple. Or you can find the founder on Twitter like I am, or message the company website. I've had candidates that have literally messaged the live chat of my website. At a big company, that's like kind of weird and doesn't actually lead anywhere because it's a black hole. But an early stage startup, generally speaking, it's the founder that's reading those live chats, I'll say, or at the very least one person removed. So reaching out to the founders personally is a very, 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 very good way of like making yourself stand out easily. Now, of course, and I'll give you an example of like an email. So the second part is like explaining exactly why you'd be a perfect fit for the role. Because at the end of the day, hiring is about matching what a company needs to what an employee can do. Generic emails, where you just say, "Good morning, hiring team. I'm looking forward to applying to your position, and I hope you accept my application. Best regards, Indra," is not gonna get you anything. In fact, I may dislike you more because of that. So it's important that when you reach out to these founders or whatever, and you're applying to these startups, is to make every word count. Sell yourself quickly and concisely. Tell them who you are, your background, and why you matter, and like why you're going to basically be a good fit for the role. So connect the dots, so to speak, and why you're best to solve their problems and meet their hiring needs. So here's some valuable examples to take a look at. Come on. Okay, so an example email from a candidate. Right away, this one is from Anthony, and we did hire him, is an example of someone who emailed us when we started hiring for our admissions counselor position. So basically, he introduces himself pretty much right away. It's like, "Hey, I'm excited to submit my materials for the admissions counselor position or whatever." And he's an experienced admissions professional apparently, and he wants to add value or whatever. Here's his resume, and he also attached like answers to our required questions for the application, basically his cover letter, and also excited about how we plan to innovate the high school education system. It's like 5 lines, and there's the attachments, of course. Thankfully, he included those. So of course, I read this email and I looked at it, and I proceeded to email him back for an interview. It's a pretty simple email, but it's also can be very, very, very effective, especially for early stage starts, because believe it or not, they generally read these emails. And frankly speaking, if they don't read the first email, if you follow up with the second email, they'll probably read that one, statistically anyways. So here's another example of making yourself stand out. So this is an example of someone who applied to our curriculum designer position and emailed us personally with a link to a Notion page with all the information about why she'd be a perfect fit for the role. So to some extent, if you're not familiar with Notion, the simple and short of it is that basically she made a small website about why she'd be a good fit for our role. So there was a lot more to this. Like it was a really long page. So I only screenshotted the top half and the bottom half. But basically, here's an example. She introduced herself. She says basically why she wants to join SORA. She even has little tabs on who she is in her resume that we could click to. She had ideas for the position, basically, of why, what she would do if she were joining SORA. And she included some other cool stuff. She also gave us a portfolio, basically, of the projects she worked on in the past that are directly relevant to the position. I was pretty interested in the BDS Army one. That was kind of cool. But the other ones were also pretty cool too. And so basically she made it really, first of all, this stood out because she built a whole website for us to look at, specifically. Not even her portfolio website. She made a website for us specifically to look at. So how could we not look at it? But also it showed a lot of intent and, frankly speaking, showed a lot of thoughtfulness that we, of course, considered when we interviewed her. And frankly speaking, she was a good fit just based on everything that we read. So this is an example of just standing out. This is the type of thing that gets, for a big company, it may seem like a waste of time because they get thousands and thousands of applications, but a very late stage startup, it really makes a difference. So yeah, I understand I kind of dumped a lot of information. I generally don't like presentations that sort of, spit a lot of empty words. So I try to make my information chock full. And I also wanted to stay on time as well. So if I have time for any questions, and the organizers can let me know if I have time to answer any questions, I'm happy to do so now. Otherwise, you can kind of move on if this is all the time I have.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have time for any questions, but we will have in Gatherly. Indra will be at the SORA Schools table. So if you have any questions for him, make sure you visit them at the table in Gatherly. All right, moving right along to the networking workshop. Let me know if you guys can't see my screen. Just unmute yourself and say something.
We can see it.
Okay, sweet.
Okay, can everyone hear me or anyone hear me? Let me just double check that real quick.
Yep.
Perfect. All right, so hey everyone. So since networking is a really big part of startup culture and making connections with people you'll need, we felt it would be really useful to kind of provide a networking 101 and just talk about the types of networking and different ways you can kind of go about it. So to start off, my name is Jill Patel, and I'm a third-year business major here at Georgia Tech. And with me is Kenneth Canampoli, who is a third-year computer science major. We are here on behalf of our business fraternity, Alpha Kappa Psi, which is the premier co-ed business fraternity on campus. We focus on growing each other's professional skills, such as networking, of course, resumes, cold calls, in addition to our social and community aspects. Kenny and I are external professional programming directors, which means that we work to spread professionalism outside of AKPsi and into the campus and community. So you've probably heard a lot about networking since coming to college, but for anyone who doesn't really truly know what it is a way of branching out your professional network just by reaching out to people in your industry. The exact definition is also here on the screen. I know for me personally, when I first started college, I understood what networking was, but I didn't really know how to go about it or the different types. So we're going to deep dive on how to get started with that. So the different types of networking kind of dictate how you approach the recruiter or industry professional and the expected behavior throughout that. The first type is group style, which can be something like an info session or a more formal dinner setting. In this setting, you have to find ways to stand out in that group that you're with. The second type is a career fair setting where you are one-on-one with the recruiter for about 10 to 15 minutes. And since that time is short, you really want to make sure you leave an impression on that recruiter. The last type is a coffee chat where you reach out to a professional in the career path that you want to position yourself for. You want to make sure that you ask the right questions to create a lasting relationship. So we've divided networking into three main steps: the initial reaching out phase, conversing and conducting yourself at the actual event, and lastly, following up. So the first step is reaching out. You really want to reach out to industry professionals that have the job you want someday and set up a coffee chat. For networking events such as a career fair, approaching recruiters from companies that you want to work for works just as well. A couple of ways to reach out are both cold emailing and LinkedIn. For each one, you want to have a clear intent about what it is you want out of this interaction or relationship. With emails, you don't always have the email of the person you want to reach out to, so tools like Rocket Reach allow you to find the format of a typical employee's email at a specific company. For example, for Dell, you may see that it's first.lastname@dell.com. For startups, like Indra was saying, you can sometimes find it through their company's website. For LinkedIn, you get the option to send a quick message when you first connect with someone, and you should always use this as an opportunity to relate with that person and kind of tell them what you want from them. To help you out with this, we have some examples on these following slides. So with this cold email, notice the general structure of this email being an introduction about yourself, followed by a focus on the other person and your intent with speaking with them. And lastly, always list some availability. For the LinkedIn message, you have limited characters, so you really want to make sure you get your point across as concisely as possible. Another great thing to do is join LinkedIn groups such as the GT alumni group, so you can find former Yellow Jackets like Indra who are likely more interested in speaking with you since they have some sort of relation to you.
The second part after you reach out is hello? Okay. The second part after you reach out is, of course, you want to actually talk with the person you are interested in or the company you are interested in. So this is step 2, converse. First thing you want to do, however, is you always want to research the other person, or the company. So this involves either reaching out on LinkedIn and stalking them a little bit on LinkedIn, seeing their experience, or looking at the company, looking at the latest news from the company, what the job offers or what the job expects. And then after you do your research, you want to plan the questions you want to ask and plan the goals you want to gain from the conversation that you're having. So for example, if you want to work at Microsoft and you reach out to someone who you want to set up a coffee chat with a worker there or an employee there, you want to look at their experience and want to ask, make sure you have a plan of what the conversation is, starting with perhaps where they went to school and what their path led up to their job that they currently are at. Now, when you're actually wanting to approach someone you want to talk to at a networking event, such as the group style or the career fair, the first step is you want to read the body language. If you are at a huge event, you want to always look for people who are just looking around by themselves, or if you're looking to join a conversation, you should look at a U or a V formation. So what this means is I hope you guys can see me, if people are standing in the U formation, there'll be an opening for you to essentially just join in. Then, of course, if you're walking around and looking around and trying to eavesdrop on a little bit on the conversation, you always want to make sure the conversation is joinable. You don't want to interrupt the conversation where they're talking about deep topics or very specific to them, but you definitely want to join if it is small talk. Of course, this always might seem a little bit awkward in the beginning, but do not be afraid of interrupting the conversation. At a networking event, you have a goal, and you don't want to let social anxiety or social awkwardness be a roadblock to you getting a goal and actually getting connections. Part two, to approaching someone to talk to. Of course, if you are joining on a big event and you have connections that have invited you, you definitely want to ask them to introduce you to other people that you think that your friend would you think that you would want to talk to. Of course, this works the other way around, that you also want to help introduce other people too, because you want to pay it forward so that they also know that they can introduce you to their friends. Finally, once you are able to join a conversation at these networking events, similar to like a group style like we're doing in the next couple of minutes, you always want to start with some sort of introduction or elevator pitch. Of course, I'm sure all of you guys are pretty ambitious. You guys already know what an elevator pitch is, but just to go through it, it's your name, your work school, your passions, and what you're looking for. The biggest thing, however, in your introduction is you always want to connect yourself to the person and company and with the conversation starter. You definitely don't want to just say your elevator pitch, talk about your school and your passions, and just leave it at that. You want to talk about what you were looking for, or perhaps incorporate your research that you've done for the person or company. For example, if you had some sort of project that works with natural language processing, and the person also has another project working with NLP, you definitely want to connect yourselves with that and say, I've been working on this project and I'd love to know a little bit more about the project you've been working at, or if it's a company, a specific project that the company has been working on. This allows them to not have an awkward way to start the conversation, and it allows them to just play right off of what you just said. How to talk with the other person. So now that you've done your introduction and you're going through your small talk, this is where your research comes in. So it might seem weird about incorporating research that you found on LinkedIn, but it actually shows that you did your research. Just like how Indra said, people who reach out to him and actually research SORA schools and know what the SORA has been through, they have better chances of actually working at the startup. So you want to incorporate your research and have clear questions that allow them to elaborate on their own life or their projects that they've been working on. However, this isn't necessarily an interview. It's a coffee chat or a conversation. You also want to talk about your own self and show that you're important too. So for example, if you're asking them about a specific work experience that they've had as a project manager, instead of letting them talk about it and just have them end it, and if it seems like the conversation's stalling and they haven't asked you about your experiences yet, don't be afraid to talk about your experiences too. After they talk about it, you talk about it to show that you're important too and you have something to offer for the company or the person that you're talking to. If the conversation ever stalls, you always want to make sure that you're keeping track of what they've talked about, talking about their projects, talking about past experiences. And if they haven't talked a little bit more about a certain project of theirs, you can always ask them about the conversation. When the conversation stalls, you can always ask them about that specific project to liven up the conversation again. Finally, you always want to end the conversation gracefully. Don't feel awkward about ending a conversation. Similar to how you shouldn't feel awkward joining a conversation, you shouldn't feel awkward about ending a conversation, because if you have a goal in mind of getting the most connections or getting very meaningful connections, you definitely need to know when to end the conversation and when to move on. However, you shouldn't be only talking to someone for 1 to 2 minutes and then ending the conversation just for the sake of getting networking. Remember, the goal is to always make meaningful connections, not a lot of connections. in order to actually end this conversation, you always want to talk about a kind word about their accomplishments or about the conversation in general. So going back to their project, saying, I love learning a lot about your project. It was really cool to learn about it, and I definitely want to help either working with it, or I will eventually do a similar project to myself. Or you can talk about the conversation in general, saying, I had a great time talking about talking with you. Then if you think that it's a meaningful connection that you want to have, ask them for their LinkedIn or their email. They're most likely will definitely give it to you, either through a business card or they'll let you connect on the spot. Now that you've actually conversed with them either in a coffee chat or in a networking event, you always want to follow up and maintain this relationship. It's not just about meeting them for maybe 5 to 10 minutes and moving on. It's about maintaining networking and maintaining your relationship. Once you have your LinkedIn and email, contact them. So if you met them at the networking event, you always want to thank them for spending time at this networking event and also highlight what you talked about. Just like Indra said, you don't want to have generic emails ever. You always want to make sure that they are very pointed and very direct towards the person you have been talking to. So make sure you highlight what you talked about and their experiences and talk about the potential next steps in conversation. So example on LinkedIn, if perhaps you've talked about how their child has gone to your school or is going to your alma mater, you definitely want to talk about, you definitely want to offer your help and advice, saying, if your son needs any help with experiencing, say, Georgia Tech culture, I could definitely reach out to him and help them. Finally, after you do the initial follow-up, you want to maintain that relationship. And LinkedIn makes this super, super easy. Pretty much anyone who goes to networking events like these, they are very active on LinkedIn because they're always about networking and talking about and showing their professional image on LinkedIn. So whenever they post something saying that they got a promotion or they're working on a certain project, make sure you interact with the post, like it, comment it, and congratulate on them. If you definitely want to make a meaningful relationship, you would also personal message them and ask them how they are doing, how they got the promotion, how the project is doing, and also just asking them for advice randomly. So another thing that I love doing is just saying happy holidays when it comes to holidays time, just to restart that conversation, and then asking them for another lunch date or coffee chat. Alrighty, thank you for listening to our presentation. Hopefully that will help. All these tips that we gave you will actually help you in the following segment, where you'll be able to talk to actual startups. If you have any questions, just email us here. You'll be getting the slide deck after the actual event.
Cool, and you can also find these guys at the networking session right after this. Now we're going to kick it over to Nakia, who's a startup catalyst at ATDC, to say a couple words about what they do.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. And it's always good to be with students. Sometimes it's a little easier for me to work with students than like real grown-ups, because real grown-ups don't listen. So at my job at ATDC, I work with grown-ups. So ATDC stands for the Advanced Technology Development Center. We work with entrepreneurs from the beginning stage all the way to their launch Series A and the market stage. We have several programming there. My responsibility is for the educate and the mentors. So I run the mentor program, and my responsibility is to kind of figure out how do I help the entrepreneurs that are there kind of grow, kind of scale. I have companies that are assigned to me in my portfolio and companies that I work with, and you will have the privilege to actually meet two of the companies this evening, Matt and Yard, which are two amazing entrepreneurs. Very passionate about what they do. And when I tell you, everyone has like their favorites, and hey, man, I see you down there. And when I tell you that they are true rock stars and they're a product of ATDC. So ATDC has been around for over 40 years. We help entrepreneurs grow. We have educational classes if you guys want anything from investor readiness to financial literacy to customer discovery. If you're thinking about building a startup, if you want to scale and grow your company, ATDC is that place for you. We also have what is called Industry Connect. It's where we have startups that have specific businesses that they would like to connect with industries. And so we have a full-time person that's what their job is to take your startup and to connect it with industry to try to get pilots and case studies or anything that you may need to help. And then we also have what is called Campus Connect, which is Joy Heimel. Some of you may know her or may get to know her. She's a great resource and intermediary between ATDC and the campus at Tech to help you guys understand any additional resources. There's a lot of rock star stuff going on at ATDC. We are here. We're a support system to help you guys. And I'm here to help and to support you guys. If you want to know anything else about ATDC, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or reach out to Peter, and Peter will make sure that I get access to that. And we do also have a special code for you guys to join ATDC. I'll make sure that Peter has that so that he can distribute that code out to you guys to become an Educate member so that you can sign up for any classes or anything that you guys want to be able to take advantage of. So just let Peter know, let me know. And he has a couple of links that he will drop in there to you. Was that fast enough, Peter? I know we got to get to our next segment.
That was perfect.
Try to say that without one breath. But thank you guys for allowing me to talk to you this evening.
Thanks so much. All right, we are a couple minutes behind, but making good time. We caught up. So I just dropped the Gatherly link in the Zoom chat below. And that's going to be where you'll get a chance to talk a little bit more with Indra, with Nakia, and with a pretty awesome roster of folks that we have coming in that are startup founders, startup recruiters, and I guess from various industries. So go ahead and join our networking now at Gatherly, and feel free to drop off this call and head over there instead. Thanks, everyone.
It's not working, or am I just tripping? It just says this site cannot be reached.
Yeah, same here.
Peter, help.
Oh, does the slash not work?
There's an added exclamation mark. Ah.
Oh, it's working for me.
Okay. The one without the exclamation mark works.
Thanks all. Let us know if you have any issues with it.
All right. Looks like I'm on. I'll see you on the other side.
See everyone on Gatherly. Bye.